In 1890, archaeologists cracked open an Egyptian tomb and found a painting on the wall. It showed 172 men dragging a giant statue, and right at the front, one small figure, pouring water onto the sand. For over 100 years, nobody thought it mattered. Then, in 2014, a team of physicists in Amsterdam ran one experiment and realized that painting was the answer to one of the oldest engineering mysteries on Earth. Stand at the base of the Great Pyramid and look up. 13 acres of stone, 480 feet high, 2.3 million blocks, stacked into the most precisely built structure of the ancient world. Most of those blocks came from the local limestone quarry, each one about 2.5 tons, a large SUV carved from rock. But the granite beams for the king's chamber, those traveled 500 miles from Aswan, 80 tons each, heavier than an M1 Abrams battle tank. Now here's where the numbers get uncomfortable. Averaged across the entire 20-year build, the crews had to place a block somewhere on the pyramid roughly every 2 to 3 minutes, all day, every day, for 2 decades. That's not one team working that fast. That's dozens of teams hauling, lifting, and setting stones simultaneously, a machine made of human beings running without pause. But speed meant nothing if the desert fought back. Try dragging a 2-ton block on a wooden sledge across dry sand. The front edge digs in. Sand piles up like a wave. Friction surges. The sled stops cold. The 2014 physics team at the University of Amsterdam tested it directly. On dry sand, the force required to pull a loaded sledge was enormous, roughly double what it should have been on a firm surface. The sand itself was the enemy. Multiply that resistance by 2.3 million trips, and the project collapses. Unless the Egyptians knew something the rest of us took 4,000 years to figure out. 1890. Archaeologists opened Tomb 17 at Deir el-Bersha, a cliff cemetery overlooking the Nile in Middle Egypt. On the wall, a sprawling scene, 172 men hauling a colossal alabaster statue of the provincial governor, Jehudiahotep. Ropes. Sledge. Organized rows of workers. And at the very front of the sledge, one small figure pouring liquid from a vessel onto the sand ahead. For decades, most Egyptologists called it a ritual act, a symbolic libation, blessing the path, honoring the gods. A few scholars quietly suggested it might be practical, but nobody ran the experiment. Then in 2014, physicist Daniel Bohn and his team at the University of Amsterdam did something remarkably simple. They built a scaled-down replica sledge, loaded it with weight, and dragged it across trays of desert sand. Dry sand? The sled buried itself, pulling force, brutal. But then they added water. Just a small amount, 2 to 5% moisture content. The pulling force dropped by half. High-speed cameras showed why. At that specific moisture level, water forms tiny bridges between sand grains, capillary bridges, that lock the grains into stiff little plates. Instead of the runners plowing through loose sand, the sled rides on top of a temporary firm surface that rebuilds itself with every step. Too little water? No effect. Too much? The sand turns to mud and the runners sink. But in that narrow sweet spot, 2 to 5%, the sand behaves almost like solid ground. And here's the beautiful part. That's exactly the amount one worker could sprinkle from a jar, walking a few steps ahead of the rope team. That painting wasn't a prayer. It was an engineering diagram. One lab experiment proves the physics. But proving that damp sand reduces friction and proving the Egyptians used it at industrial scale are two different things. So what does the evidence actually show? The pyramid sits on a flat limestone plateau. The main quarry was less than 1/3 of a mile away. Between the two, archaeologists have found the remains of prepared causeways, graded, compacted paths wide enough for multiple sledge teams to operate side by side. The picture that emerges from the archaeological and experimental evidence is this. Crews dampened the sand surface along these causeways in a continuous relay. Workers stationed at intervals kept the track in that critical moisture range, wet enough to firm up the sand, dry enough to avoid mud. Water wasn't scarce. During the annual Nile flood, exactly when the largest labor force was available, the river rose high enough to reach canal systems and catchment basins near the construction site. Channels carved into the plateau directed flood water to where it was needed. The result? A self-renewing highway. a surface that could support heavy sledges trip after trip, maintained by the simplest possible technology, clay jars, and human hands. Multiple sledge teams operating simultaneously could move hundreds of blocks per day, enough to keep the stonemasons on the pyramid busy without pause. And the water did more than just reduce friction. It suppressed dust, critical when thousands of workers are breathing desert air for months. It stabilized the path surface, reducing injuries. And it let supply sledges carrying tools and food move faster alongside the stone haulers, tightening the entire logistics chain. The desert didn't stop the Egyptians. They taught the desert to cooperate. This is the part most pyramid documentaries skip, and honestly, it might be more impressive than the pyramid itself. In the 1990s, archaeologist Mark Lehner excavated the workers' village just south of the pyramid complex. What he found wasn't a slave camp. It was a city, industrial-scale bakeries, breweries producing thick, nutritious beer, more like a fermented porridge than anything you drink today, coppersmithies for sharpening and recycling tools, fish processing facilities, storage magazines filled with grain. Animal bones tell the story of the diet: beef, mutton, goat, fish. Analysis of the bones shows these workers were eating roughly 4,000 calories a day. They were fed better than most people in the ancient world. And the organization was staggering. Inside the pyramid itself, red-painted graffiti on hidden blocks records the crew structure. The workforce was divided into large groups, called files, with names like Friends of Khufu and Companions of Khufu. Each file was subdivided into smaller teams of roughly 200 men, each with its own identity and, apparently, its own competitive streak. Inscriptions in later records suggest a total conscript workforce of around 20 to 25,000 during the peak flood season, supplemented by a smaller year-round crew of skilled masons and engineers. This was project management on papyrus. Shifts, rotations, supply ledgers, ration lists. Everything moved by boat during the Nile flood, when the river became a superhighway. Recent discoveries, including the remains of a harbor basin just east of the pyramid complex, confirm that goods were delivered practically to the construction site's front door. The Egyptians took a natural disaster, the annual flood that shut down farming, and turned it into a conveyor belt of labor, stone, food, and tools. That's not primitive. That's brilliant. This is the most debated question in pyramid studies, and unlike the wet sand discovery, this one isn't fully settled. So let's walk through what we know, what we don't, and where the best evidence points. Option 1. A single straight ramp from ground to summit. Simple idea, massive problem. A ramp at a usable gradient, say 10%, would need to be nearly a mile long. It would contain more material than the pyramid itself, and no trace of such a structure has ever been found. Option 2. A straight ramp that only reaches 1/3 of the pyramid's height. This actually makes mathematical sense. The bottom third of the pyramid contains the vast majority of the stone, over 70% by volume. A moderate external ramp could deliver most of the blocks, and then be dismantled as the pyramid rose. But what about the upper 2/3? Option 3. An internal spiral ramp. But, and this is important, this theory is not proven. It's one of the strongest models on the table. Other researchers argue for external wraparound ramps, or lever-based systems, or combinations we haven't imagined yet. What is clear from the physical evidence, post holes in the Grand Gallery show where wooden beams were inserted, probably as anchor points or braking systems for hauling heavy loads upward. These beams could be repositioned as the work progressed, like movable railway sleepers, giving crews rest points between pulls. The honest answer? We know the blocks went up. We know ramps of some kind were involved. The exact configuration is still debated, and might have changed as the pyramid grew. It wasn't one solution. It was probably adaptive engineering, refined floor by floor, problem by problem. If you think the Great Pyramid was rough and ready, a pile of blocks stacked by brute force, these numbers will change your mind. The pyramid's base is level to within 2 centimeters across 230 meters. That's a deviation of less than 1/100th of 1%. For context, that level of precision over that distance would challenge a modern survey crew using optical or GPS equipment. On a construction site in 2500 BCE, using no metal straightedges and no optical instruments, it borders on absurd. How did they do it? The leading theory: they flooded the foundation trenches with water and use the waterline itself as a level. Cut reference posts to the same height above the water surface. Drain the trenches, and you got a perfectly level datum across the entire site. A low-tech laser level. Accurate to millimeters. And the precision didn't stop at the foundation. The outer casing stones, originally smooth white Tura limestone, were joined so tightly that the gaps measured roughly half a millimeter, thinner than a credit card. On some joints, you genuinely cannot fit a razor blade between the blocks. On hidden interior surfaces, places no one was ever meant to see, workers left casual redo-cray marks. This side up. Crew names. Orientation arrows. Quality control, notes that survived 4,500 years later. These weren't slaves scrawling on walls. These were skilled tradespeople signing their work. Above the king's chambers sit 5 so-called relieving chambers, stacked horizontal spaces separated by massive granite beams. Their job, distribute the weight of the pyramid above and prevent the chamber ceiling from collapsing. Each beam weighs between 40 and 80 tons. They were quarried in Aswan, shipped 500 miles by barge, and somehow raised over 150 feet into the pyramid's core. These beams were too long and too heavy to navigate a tight internal spiral ramp. So how did they get in? Jean-Pierre Houdin's theory, and it is still a theory, not a confirmed fact, proposes an elegant solution. The beams were hauled up the pyramid's outer face on a temporary construction ramp, then slid horizontally through a gap intentionally left in the masonry at the chamber level. Once the beams were in position, the gap was sealed with fill stones and the outer casing was completed over it. From outside, the repair is invisible. But in 2017, the Scan Pyramids project, using muon tomography, a technique that tracks cosmic ray particles passing through stone, detected a large void above the Grand Gallery. The exact nature and purpose of that void is still debated, but it confirms that the pyramid's internal structure is more complex than a simple stack of blocks. Whether Houdin's specific beam theory is correct or not, the underlying point stands. The builders planned for the hardest problems before they started building. The solution for the 80-ton beams was designed into the structure from day one. That's not muscle. That's architecture. The historical record says Khufu reigned for about 23 years. The pyramid had to be finished within his lifetime, ideally well before, so the mortuary complex could be completed too. Can the evidence support a 20-year build? Radiocarbon dates from organic material found in the pyramid's mortar, charcoal fragments, reed matting cluster between roughly 2,600 and 2,500 BCE, consistent with Khufu's reign, though with the wide error margins typical of radiocarbon dating. The conventional dates of approximately 2580 to 2560 BCE come from historical king lists and astronomical records, not carbon dating alone. Animal bone counts from the workers' village show that slaughter rates, and therefore food consumption and workforce size, peaked during the flood months, exactly when conscript labor was available and river transport was running. Copper tool wear rates, sledge cycle estimates, food intake data, every independent metric points to the same conclusion. The schedule was punishing. But it was achievable. With water, sledges, organization, and a workforce fed and managed at a level that wouldn't be matched for millennia, the impossible became a logistics problem, and the Egyptians solved it. Before we wrap up, let's be honest about the gaps. Because intellectual honesty is what separates real history from conspiracy content. We don't know the exact ramp configuration. The internal spiral ramp model is compelling, but unproven. We don't know the purpose of the big void detected by muon tomography in 2017. It could be a construction ramp, a structural feature, a second Grand Gallery, or something we haven't thought of yet. We don't know precisely how many workers were involved at peak, or how the workforce changed year to year. And we don't have a single written document. No blueprint, no master plan that describes a pyramid's design or construction sequence from start to finish. What we do have is a convergence of physical evidence, experimental confirmation, archaeological context, and mathematical plausibility that tells a coherent story. Even if some chapters are still being written, the Great Pyramid is not a closed case, but it's not an open mystery either. It's a work in progress, and that's what makes it exciting. When the capstone was set, the causeways were dismantled, the basins silted over, the harbor retreated back toward the Nile. But the knowledge didn't disappear. It evolved. Middle Kingdom tombs, built centuries later, show smaller statues being hauled the same way, always with a water bearer at the front. The technique was standard practice. By the New Kingdom, new tools entered the picture. Bronze replaced copper. Animal-powered capstans supplemented human hauling. Construction methods diversified. The wet sand technique didn't vanish, but it was joined by other innovations and eventually stopped being remarkable enough to document. The knowledge wasn't lost. It just became ordinary. The way plumbing is ordinary. The way concrete is ordinary. The most successful technologies don't stay impressive. They become invisible. When the 2014 experiment went public, it didn't rewrite physics. The science of wet sand was well understood. What it changed was us. For centuries, we defaulted to two stories. Either the pyramid was built by whipped slaves, suffering as spectacle, or it was built by aliens or lost civilizations or technologies we can't explain. Both stories have something in common. They both assume we couldn't do it, that ordinary human beings, with ordinary tools, couldn't possibly achieve something this extraordinary. The truth is simpler, and harder to accept because it asks more of us. A worker with a clay jar, walking ahead of a rope team, wetting the sand one splash at a time, doing it right, doing it again, doing it for 20 years. Today, road crews still spray water before compacting gravel. The principle hasn't changed in 4,500 years. The Great Pyramid is not an enigma. It's a mirror. A reminder that the most extraordinary things humans have ever built were built with magic. They were built with patience, with planning, with logistics that would humble a modern supply chain manager, and with 20 years of steady pay in bread and beer. From above, the Great Pyramid still casts its shadow across the plateau. The river still floods. The wind still moves the same grains of sand those workers once tamed. And the monument they left behind still says the same thing it said the day the capstone was set. We didn't need miracles. We needed each other.